Right. Good afternoon. Nice to meet you all. Yes, I'm Rick, and I'm presenting some of the things that I found in my main current research project at the moment, which just says entitled "The Hidden Other and the Neurodivergent Paradox: Autistic-Coded Representation in Horror." So it's mainly about the representation of autistic-coded characters within horror and how they are presented. First thing, as you often have to do, is justify why. So why this research? So I turned 38 on Monday. I was 30, oh, thanks. I was 36 when I found out that I'm autistic. And at first it's really liberating if you look back on your life and go, that's why. And then it makes you very angry because you look back in your life and go, that's why. And there is a lot of kind of anger at looking back at what was lost. And this project, I guess, is me trying to do something with that anger. And I also have always loved horror, as I'm sure many of you do through here. And I very much believe these two things are related. And I want to explore how, and I think a big part of that is the other. I'm sure you're aware of the concept, but I will go over it shortly if not. That I think reflects my own otherness that I've always felt, and I think that's something I can relate to in horror. And then the question is it useful for me to see my otherness reflected, or for autistic people to see that otherness reflected? Or is this potentially damaging and reinforcing? That's one question I was asking myself. So this is the motivation behind the research. So my plan is, so I've been a teacher for many years. I'm a horror author. I was a teacher, full-time horror author, back to part-time teacher and part-time horror author. So I'm used to kind of having to go through my learning objectives at the beginning of my lessons. So a plan is I'm going to go through what I mean by autistic coded, why I'm not using the word autistic, the theoretical framework that's informing this research, then some of what I've found so far looking at the autistic coded child in the modern horror film, and a bit more in-depth study on Frankenstein, and then some conclusions and potential next steps at the end. Just go through a few definitions in terms of when I refer to certain things. And it's important to go through these words because of the amount of times I hear people getting it wrong. When we refer to neurodiversity, I'm referring to everyone. Everyone is neurodiverse. Everyone thinks in their own particular way. Neurodivergent is when someone does not think according to what is the societal standard of normal. And neurotypical is when you do think according to the societal standard of what is considered to be normal. I say this because a lot of people refer to people who are autistic as people who are neurodiverse, which isn't technically correct. It's neurodivergence. That's what I mean in terms of those phrases. And of course, neurodivergent is generally encompass autism, ADHD, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, and what's the other one? Dyslexia. Although there's debate as to whether things like borderline personality disorder come into that as well, but those are the predominant ones. And I use the term autistic coded rather than autistic because I'm identifying characters that are autistic coded. But I can't see inside those characters' minds, partly because I can't read their minds, partly because they're fictional and don't have minds. And to call them autistic is assuming a diagnosis or self-identification by the filmmaker, the writer, or the character, which is not there, whereas autistic coded for me suggests autistic without the need for that diagnosis or identification. Two big reasons behind this. As an autistic person, I think I would resent people saying this character is autistic based on some traits that they have. And I think that I want to avoid assumptions and labeling autistic people may resent. Another big problem is that historically, characters won't have been diagnosed. I will talk about Frankenstein, which was written in 1818, which is over 100 years before the term entered. Even nowadays, we don't have a very good understanding of it. Go back 10 years, you wouldn't really have any characters who were overtly, unless they were quite harmful stereotypes. So there's not going to be that many. However, I don't want to start diagnosing characters. Autism may present certain ways. Ultimately, it's about the way you think, not about how you present. And so I don't want to make assumptions about how someone thinks. But how do I identify people as autistic coded then, is the next question. When we talk about the autistic spectrum, a lot of people talk about it as being like a line that you're further or not as far along. which we kind of need to start going away from that thinking now, because you're not further or longer along the line, you're autistic or you're not autistic. And instead start thinking about it as a circle, which just was used by Kahle in her TED talk in 2021. Just take from there, and this is why autistic people present so differently, because you could be more or less on some of these and still be autistic, and therefore present very differently to a different autistic person. And these are the main 8 parts of the spectrum I'm looking at. So executive function, kind of in terms of how well you take care of yourself; sensory processing, in terms of how whether you have sensory issues in terms of audio, visually. For neurotypical people, can often talk to someone in a crowded room and push everything away and focus on that person. Me as an autistic person, I hear everything, I see every light, I experience all the senses of that room at once. And so that's the kind of difference with that. Verbal and non-verbal communication, sometimes you can be mute or selectively mute. If you have a shutdown, you can become mute, for example. Motor skills, often linked with clumsiness, as a lack of a better way to put it. Social skills, that there isn't an instinctive understanding, or that neurotypical people often have. Formal processing, in terms of processing things. Repetitive behaviors, we're looking at things like stimming, which is like repetitive behavior, or you'll see me doing it a lot at the moment because I tend to stim a lot. And also kind of ritualistic behavior. Perseverative thinking is where things like special interests come from, and when you are really fixated on a sense of injustice as well, for example. My love of horror is definitely perseverative thinking, because it consumes my life. It's not just a passing interest. It is my phone case, my tattoos, everything. Also thinking about experiences that people may relate to, in terms of being frequently misinterpreted, masking, constant burnout, shutdowns and meltdowns, special interests, and identity conflict. Many people will say, yes, but we all have some of these. We do. But for an autistic-coded character, I'm looking for someone who has multiple ones of these, and to a point that it disables them. So autism is classed as a disability. Whether or not we agree with that terminology or not is another debate to have. But it's that because these things exist to such an extent that it disables you in many situations. So it needs to be multiple of these and present to a certain extent. In case you're not sure what I mean by any of these, I'm not going to read these all through. There's one you're not sure of. You can quickly have a look now and kind of see what kind of things I'm looking for. So look at the theoretical framework. So we're looking at the other, which is one of the foundational theories of horror, which was introduced by Robin Wood in 1979. The idea of that does not fit in as normal or typical as determined by a society or culture, and is often presented as monster or monstrous within horror. And this is from monster theory as well. It's important that we understand the context to determine why something is monstrous. It's a big part of what I'm saying today. So we talk about the other, talking about a character that's presented as monstrous or as a monster because they do not fit with society's standard of what someone should be. And this was Wood's list of the 8 things he determined were often presented as the other. I do need to recognize this study was done in 1979. And we've come a long way since then. And I think there's a lot more to add to this list. And compared to then, I think there's a lot more nuanced portrayals of the other in horror. So there is a lot more to add to this now. And my addition, number 9, would be neurodivergence. The fact that you can, if any of you want to tell me I'm wrong, Nate, that's fine. The fact that I can find so little challenging this theory does suggest it is quite a foundation of horror. There is, of course, a lot challenging the psychoanalytical reading of horror that he buys into, but in terms of the other itself as a concept, I found very little to challenge it. There is Lovenstein's monograph from 2022 on transformative otherness, where he extends on Wood's theory, to say that whilst Wood thinks the other is a fixed character, Lovenstein feels that there is a war between the monstrous self and normal self within the character, and the status of the other kind of is transformative within a character. And I'm going to kind of draw on this when I talk about Frankenstein a bit later. And I also hypothesize that horror has a large neurodivergent fan base. If anyone can find a study that proves this, please send it to me, because I've been searching everywhere for some empirical evidence to back this up. At the moment, I can't find any. So it is still a hypothesis. However, I don't like using anecdotal evidence. I don't think any of us does, but there is a large amount of it. I came across many bloggers talking about their links of being autistic with the love of horror. As a horror author, I get emails from readers, and I meet readers when I've done signings at conventions and when I go to horror festivals as a punter, and a lot of them talk to me about their neurodivergence and that links. And there's also the logic behind it as well. The fact that horror has quite frequent rules and tropes, use of characters who are outcasts and a voice for marginalized communities, that there is a logic behind why it would exist. So I'm fairly confident in saying this, though I do recognize I haven't got any empirical evidence to back it up. And I very much believe this is because of the other. The other provides an experience the neurodivergent can relate to, because we see them being treated as not normal, as other, by a society, because they do not present as people expect them to within that society. Therefore, they're treated as the other. There are autistic characters in literature and film, but there are very few that give a decent representation. We could go back to the 80s and look at Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man as the savant, white, overly intelligent man. We could look at Sheldon in Big Bang Theory as a more recent one. All of these aren't necessarily faithful to the reality of autism for many autistic people. And a lot of them, as this person in this study found, that they are often white, male and middle class, young, adorable, serious, detached and non-threatening, good at maths and science. There's a lot of savantism within it. There is very little representation, for example, of black autism, female autism, working class autism, historic autism, or intersectional autism. The representation of characters who are overtly labeled as autistic in literature and film are done as neurotypical people see them, which is something I'm going to touch on a little bit later in a bit more detail. And so when we have very little representation, where do we find our representation? In the other. Which leads me to what I am terming the neurodivergent horror paradox. That we search for horror for the other. This provides comforts as it validates our experiences. At the same time, it's paradoxical as it also alienates and reinforces the feeling of being separate. So there's a question of, is this something good, or is this something that we need to look at, which I think very much comes down to opinion. So now I'm going to have a look at a few details of some of the characters I've looked at specifically. Looking specifically at children who are often portrayed as the mother's burden. Autistic-coded children who are often portrayed as a burden to the mother or the parent. And looking at these three films specifically. So looking at The Babadook, I'm not the only person who has identified the child in The Babadook as autistic-coded. This critic did as well. They put it down to the child's trouble relating to his peers, difficulty in a traditional school setting, sleep disorders, his fixation on mechanical weapons and repetitive behaviors, his seizures, and the fact that many parents of autistic children can relate to this. My personal interpretation was the inability of the school to manage his needs when the mother begs for some understanding. His intense emotional response, for me, shows when he shouts, "Do you want to die?" to his mother, that shows a kind of non-neurotypical sequence of thought in the way that he's come to that conclusion in that emotional dysregulation. And his special interest in magic as well. But this isn't a film about the autistic-coded child. This is a film about how hard it is to be a mother. This is a film about the exhaustion of motherhood, the psychological horror of Amelia's mental state, the pressure placed on women to be good mothers despite the fact that capitalist societies rely on the unpaid labor of women for it to thrive. And I really want to recognize how great it is we are now having films that do represent the true experience of being a parent. I've got an almost 2-year-old, and it's tough. And before then, we've had these kind of la-di-da films of how wonderful is it. It is great we're finally getting films that are representing the true complexity and challenge of being a parent. Why does the child need to be autistic coded to do that? Is my question. So why it's hard enough without an autistic child? Why does a child need to be autistic coded? Very much linked to that film is Hereditary, where the character of Charlie are very much identified as autistic coded. Firstly, her act of stimming, when she goes throughout the film, I see that very much as an act of stimming. Her difficulty in relating to peers. She presents as selectively mute, repetitive ritualistic interest in art. And the fact that she is very allergic to nuts, she shows a lack of awareness on how to manage it that you might expect from a child that age, which suggests elements of executive function. Spoiler, she dies half an hour through. And much as The Babadook also features the mother dealing with the death of her husband, this film is about the mother's inability to grieve for a daughter. And the demon that possesses the mother was residing in Charlie throughout. And the demon that was attached to the autistic-coded child then goes on to inhabit the mother, the demon Paimon. Again, why did this child need to be autistic-coded? To emphasize how difficult it was. And there we go on to Come Play. And I find it very hard to talk about this film without being angry. And you'll see why. This boy is overtly diagnosed as autistic in this film, so I don't need to say autistic-coded. The filmmaker in the film recognizes him as autistic. He's non-verbal. He struggles to relate to his peers. Despite him being introduced as a protagonist and it being his story, he does not defeat the monster, the mother does. He's not even given that autonomy. And at the end, overcoming the monster is a way of overcoming the mother's difficulty being a mother. And this is why it makes me so angry. Toward the end, he stops being non-verbal, starts talking, and makes friends with the boys who bullied him. He gets over being autistic, essentially. And that's nicer for the mother. So again, decreasing the mother's burden. And this is a harmful example of what I am framing as the neurotypical gaze. So taking Laura Mulvey's theory from the 1970s of the male gaze, where she very much observed how film and literature is often from the male perspective. All the characters, everything is from a man's perspective. I will extend on that and say it's also from the neurotypical perspective, so referring to that as a neurotypical gaze. And for me, this often incorporates the medical model or social model of disability. So the medical model says there's a problem with a disabled person. Social model says there's a problem with society. So to take a physical disability, if someone's in a wheelchair and there's a building and they can't get into that building, the medical model will say that's because they're in a wheelchair. The social model will say that's because there isn't a ramp outside the building. The neurotypical gaze is often very much framed around the medical model, that it's a disability within the person they need to overcome, rather than the social model whereby society needs to accommodate. And that is very much what Come Play does. The child is non-verbal and experiences social difficulties. The neurodivergent yearning for that character's success is that he is accepted and he is accommodated, and his mother gets support and society finds a way for him to flourish. What actually happens, the child becomes verbal, starts talking, starts making friends with the boys who actually bullied him, thus fits better into a neurotypical society. He overcomes his disability, he's not accommodated. And that's what we look at with how much the neurotypical gaze persists, which takes us back to what I mentioned about Sheldon and Big Bang and Dustin Hoffman, Rayman. These are very much the neurotypical gaze version of autistic characters. Then we have a child who's seen as the prelude to serial killing. Though I'll accept a bit of a debate about whether this character is autistic-coded. So Rob Zombie's Halloween, which for me is the best Halloween movie, and I'm willing to fight you on that. So he is misinterpreted by an education establishment that's not built for his neurodivergence. He has a special interest in masks. When he's older, you can see them lining the walls of his asylum cell. His need to wear masks could also reflect his disconnection to society and difficulty relating to others. He does become selectively mute after his mother stops visiting him and takes her own life. There is some debate here that you could argue that's due to his trauma and maybe not due to him being autistic-coded, but because of his trauma. However, I would argue that his trauma is because of him being autistic-coded, and a lot of things that happened to him that caused him trauma come out of being autistic-coded. And this is, again, another feature of the autistic experience. You get to a certain age, especially if you're undiagnosed, there will be lots of elements of trauma that you've experienced that are linked to you being autistic. There was a mixed critical reception to this film. One person said that Michael Myers, that was the guy who played Austin Powers, was both too human and not human enough, which means we struggled when how to draw the line between human and monster. I think that critic misses the point, that is the point. This interpretation relies on a very distinct binary. And this is why I'll bring in Lovenstein's theory, transformative otherness, where he talks about the battle between monstrous self and normal self. This disparity represents the situation where one might feel toward a society that repeatedly alienates them, where one becomes a victim-villain hybrid. You may wish to see Myers as not human, but you're confronted by human. This very much recognizes the complexity of a society who drives you to resent that society. You end up becoming the monster society creates you to be. There are some attempts at positive representations of autistic characters. Again, the neurotypical gaze is present. The Predator in 2018, where they say that this boy, because he's autistic, is actually the next step in evolution, because apparently autism is the next step in evolution. The Predator wants him because of that reason, because he's autistic, he's the next step in evolution. And the opening scene, there is a fire alarm going off in the school, and the boy is having a sensory meltdown because of it, and two bullies knock all the pieces over in chess club. The boy then has remembered where every chess piece was. So once the bullies leave, he goes and puts all the chess piece back. No autistic person can do that. It's not realistic. Again, this is the neurotypical gaze of savantism present within these films. Hellbound 2, Hellraiser, Hellblazer 2. Tiffany is selectively mute, fixate on patterns and puzzles, but again, this fixation is only useful because it helps the neurotypical characters progress. The lesson here is these traits are only good when they help neurotypical people or capitalism or society succeed in a conventional way. So when we talk about this paradox, it's really great that we have the sense of the other, but when you also see how these characters are framed, how they present, it does reinforce some of the potentially harmful messages. One good representation is Carrie, and I'm taking the 2013 version with Chloe Grace Moretz. Again, controversial, but I think it's better than the Sissy Spacek version. Sorry. I don't necessarily see the original one. I think there's debate in the original whether she's autistic-coded. In this one, I very much do recognize autistic-coded. In the opening scene, when she's in a swimming pool, the sound effect they do with the audio, where it kind of comes more very much reflects sensory issues that she's having in terms of the audio of that place, her social withdrawal. There's a point in it when she reads a poem to the class, and the class, even though she was asked to read a poem, other her for the poem that she's chosen, which again reflects how you're often treated for your special interests as an autistic person, which anyone who loves horror will probably have experienced at some point. And when she actually says to her mum, I need to try and be a normal person before it's too late, represents that kind of idea of masking. I very much see the mother and the daughter stimming in this, but they stim differently. So the mother, during times of emotional intensity, stims by self-harming. When she's getting quite emotionally dysregulated, at one point she jabs some scissors into her leg. However, the daughter's stimming, I very much see as her special powers, because they come at a time of emotional dysregulation, emotional intensity, and it's her way of handling it, much like stimming is, and it becomes a bit of a repetitive act. And so she not only takes revenge against the bullies, but she takes revenge on the teachers who failed in allyship, lack of awareness, and not educating students in a system that enabled, perpetuated, and proliferated othering. So extend on that. At the end, when she takes revenge on everyone, she does it against the bullies, but she also does it against the teachers. And we've got Mr. Jardin, who people will say she tried to help Carrie. I will say she tried to help her in quite a misinformed way. So when the students bully Carrie, Mr. Jardin goes 100% discipline. She punishes them all entirely and then further alienates them from Carrie. There's no attempt to try and explain, as well as discipline, this is why Carrie presents this way and this is what we need to do. Probably because she doesn't get it herself, which represents and reflects a lot of teachers who work within the education system, a lot of experienced autistic people have going through school. And the education system, for that reason, does often reinforce the othering that autistic children go through. And as a result, Carrie is only taking revenge against the bullies, but against the entire education system that has othered her, and she does it through an act of stimming that she might have otherwise been ridiculed for, which is why it's quite cathartic. Recognizing very clearly that there's a difference between fiction and real life. In real life, we're not going to destroy everything in a gymnasium at prom, but within a fictional realm, witnessing it can be quite cathartic in that sense. If you go to Return to Repressed with Wood, in terms of what we repress coming out. But then the question is, why must this be what the representation of the other is for an autistic person to feel empowered? How am I doing for time? Half past. So I'm going to go a little bit more detail into Frankenstein and look at this explorer's case study a bit more. This is a quote from the book, one of my all-time favorite books. It's a brilliant book. And this, in fact, I'm going to read out a full, even though I hate it when people stand and just read out PowerPoints to you. I'm still going to read it out because it's such a brilliant quote. As I read, however, this is when he has met Frankenstein after he's gone away for a few years and learned. And he talks about the fact that he read some literature, and he talks about the experience of reading that literature to Frankenstein. And he says, I applied much personally to my own feelings and condition. I found myself similar, yet at the same time strangely unlike to the beings concerning whom I read and to whose conversation I was a listener. I sympathized with and partly understood them, but I was uniformed in mind. I was dependent on none and related to none. What did this mean? Who was I? What was I? Whence did I come? What was my destination? These questions continually recurred, but I was unable to solve them. This could also be very accurately describing the feeling of being an autistic person within society. Do you read literature and see films and you see people who are like you, who you can kind of recognize in that aspect, but they're also not like you? And again, this can be not just autistic representation, there's many other kind of people who could probably relate to that as well. He understood them but didn't relate to them. He kind of saw himself in them but wasn't fully like them. And that for me is why he very much represents the other, the autistic-coded other in that sense as well. And I also see Victor Frankenstein as autistic-coded. I'm going to explain why I see them both as autistic-coded. So Victor Frankenstein, his fixation on his scientific pursuit, that shows me perseverative thinking, a special interest. Social withdrawal when focused on his task, shows his social skills, perseverative thinking, special interest. His need for routine, and his challenge with cognitive empathy. Again, autistic people don't lack empathy, just empathy presents as different to how a neurotypical person presents it as cognitive empathy, where you might take on the emotions, but not necessarily take on the experience of the actions. I'm not going to read all these out because there's a lot of them, but I went through the book and I found evidence for all of these things. And these are all quotes from the book. Feel free to have a quick look over them, but I'll be here for a few days if I read all of them out. So these are his fixations and special interests of Victor Frankenstein. This is him talking about his pursuit of trying to create the creature from lots of dead bodies, and about him trying to learn about different things when he's exploring philosophy. Here's evidence for how other people misinterpret his behavior, from the mental burnout he has after socializing, his emotional dysregulation, challenges with cognitive empathy. I'll leave them there for a few seconds if you want to have a quick glance over them. Kind of gives some idea about the amount of evidence that I did find in the book of these things. Then Frankenstein's creation. Notice I'm not calling him Frankenstein's monster. My daughter's favorite toy is a little Frankenstein's creation, and we make sure he's called Frankenstein's creation because he only became a monster because society made him a monster. So I see he is attempting to learn about social cues. The fact that he is seen as wrong or monstrous for how he presents. Special interest style driven learning, so the way he wants to learn about people and the world very much reflects having a special interest as an autistic person. There's emotional dysregulation, and there are some references to sensory issues. There's a lot of evidence in this in the book, so again, I'm not going to read it all out. But on the left, you can see him becoming used to his experience of othering, and how he felt in terms of responding to othering, some of the sensory issues he experienced, some of the emotional dysregulation. His special interest style, fixation-driven learning, is attempting to learn social conventions. Again, there's a lot of it in the book. And to look at the films as well. I haven't included Guillermo del Toro's one yet because I haven't watched it yet, because I've heard about how much he changes and I can't bear to watch it, though I know I need to. But the 1931 version of Frankenstein, I looked at some of the film versions to see if this would be backed up as well. So we've got, for Victor Frankenstein, the fact that Elizabeth reads over his letter and her perception of his special interests is very much like a neurotypical person may see. She thinks it's insanity because of how much he's consumed by his special interest. Again, his scholars say that he's brilliant, but he troubles them. Again, they don't understand that he's not presented as conventionally neurotypical in the way he pursues his interests. And the other people are anxious about bringing the creature to life, but he ignores that because of his strength of his fixation. The creation, Igor, who didn't exist in the book, enters, and then the creation stands up and throws himself away as if he's in the middle of an autistic meltdown. And he whips into control of the meltdown, whilst autistic people have been whipped, but we have experienced punishment for what presents as meltdowns if you go through school, for example. And then they hear him banging against the doors of his room as if his meltdown is continuing. He reacts negatively to the torch, potential sensory issue, and again shows a lack of instinctive social understanding. So there's a point where there's a girl throwing flowers into a lake, and he throws the flowers into the lake, and then he picks up the girl and throws her in, not realizing that he's meant to throw the flowers in, not the girl. I don't think many autistic people would make that mistake, but it is very much reflective of the experience of trying to learn social conventions and not always get it right. It's like learning another language. Sometimes when you learn French, you may get a verb form in the wrong place. It's the same with social conventions. You may learn one, but not quite get it in the right place and come across as a bit harmful or weird to other people who don't quite understand. And that, for me, this represents that experience. The 2015 version, I haven't included Victor Frankenstein because he wasn't really in it that much. And he was kind of split between 3 different people in this film. But the same incident with the girl in the lake happens in this one. There's a scene where the police officers shoot a dog, and Frankenstein's creation doesn't understand the social convention of obeying officers and is overridden by his fixation on morality and emotional dysregulation, his prompts. And he's put in a straitjacket by police officers because of how his behavior manifests. He's othered rather than being understood. And finally, the 1994 version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was supposed to be the most faithful one, but has such an absurd ending. I don't know if it can be. Again, with Victor Frankenstein, you see his perseverative thinking, his special interests, the way that Elizabeth says, "You're so hungry for knowledge," the way he doesn't write to her when he's in pursuit of his fixation. When she shows up unannounced, he's in quite a state. There's suggestions of problem with executive function there. The argument against him being autistic coded in this version of it is that they give him motivation for a special interest, because he doesn't like that his mother's died and he doesn't want anyone to die, so he wants to revive people from the dead. So rather than being something thought, oh, I'm going to do that and pursue it, at the same time, a special interest can come from motivation. So I recognize there's some debate around that. The creation. He's attacked when he's discovered trying to eat some bread without buying it. So again, he doesn't understand the social convention and he's othered for it. He has an unconventional interpretation of morality. So there's a family who are struggling to harvest their food. So he, without them noticing, harvests a lot of them. Yet even though he tries to do something good, he's still othered for how they interpret his actions, which again is a very relatable experience. His emotional dysregulation when he meets up with Frankenstein after he's been traveling is really summed up in this brilliant quote. You gave me all these emotions, but you didn't tell me how to use them. That, for me, sums up emotional dysregulation so well. However, again, an argument against this one. There's the famous scene in Frankenstein in the book after Frankenstein's creation has gone away and he's learnt about everything, and he meets Frankenstein again after years and he tells him the story of where he's been. That confrontation within the film, and like the book, he doesn't tell his story, try to educate Frankenstein in the same way. He swears revenge without the full content of the scene, and therefore he comes across as less sympathetic and more justifiably a monster in this. So him becoming a monster, for me, is quite abrupt in the film, rather than a gradual process of othering. So I don't think it does give the nuance of the experience quite as the book does. But we can link Frankenstein to this idea of masking as well. If you think about Wood's theory of the return of the repressed, where he said that horror is what we repressed comes out in horror, most autistic people learn to mask. So you learn how to try and pretend to be neurotypical. And it's what burns autistic people out, because it's such a hard performance to keep up. But it's deeply built into within the society. That's what you need to do. Frankenstein's creation doesn't mask. And therefore we witness what happens when he doesn't mask. So performing and doing this masking means repressing, which is why it comes out in horror, if that makes sense. But then to link it with transformative otherness and Lovenstein's extension of Wood's theory, the status of the other is transferred between Frankenstein and his creation throughout, depending on our perspective, depending on what point the story is, depending on what they're doing, and within the same character as well. They both are morally wrong at different parts of the story. They both go between being the monster and the victim, the mass neurodivergent and the one who attacks. So the status of mass self and neurodivergent other is ultimately the transformative otherness that exists in both of these characters, crossed over through roles, status, and sympathy. So, some conclusions. When we see Frankenstein's creation as an autistic-coded person tries to fit in and tries to mask, we also see the negative effects of this when it fails. We see how he's continually alienated and how his behavior is interpreted when based on neurotypical presentation. And it's very much evidence that society creates its own monsters. And it suggests to us why an autistic person may grow up to resent a world that continually others them, and then be resented back for it by that world when people don't understand where the resentments come from. With this way, the other within horror provides a good platform for us to have a language to explain how masking and about othering autistic people can have an effect on people. And examples of the autistic-coded child demonstrate that othering that unknowingly takes place when we're unaware. So I don't think many people recognize the issues with come play, the fact that he overcomes his disability. And that, for me, highlights how unaware many people are of what's actually going on within society. And so for this reason, I think this shows us we need to challenge the neurotypical gaze. I'm going to use the film Get Out as an example of how this could work, the fact that Get Out was made by a black auteur, for me, as someone from a white middle-class background, that film taught me a lot of things I was unaware of, a lot of the nuance of the situation. You can understand racism is bad, don't be racist, but in terms of white privilege and a lot of the nuances, that film helped me to understand some of it. If that was made by someone who wasn't black, would it have done that to the same extent? Would those nuances still have been in there? Which is why perhaps by enabling neurodivergent filmmakers in an industry that probably isn't particularly neurodivergent friendly in the way it works, would help to challenge the neurotypical gaze. And we are starting to do this now in terms of using the other to challenge the way that we see things. And my final line, horror holds up a mirror to society. Do not blame what you see in the reflection.